Some people have lately been making the claim that sourdough bread, is free of all the problems typically associated with wheat consumption or with non-fermented breads. So let's take the evidence and consider each and every argument one by one, and I'll show you that none of this is true. There's almost no truth in it at all. The whole collection of arguments behind sourdough bread, in fact, remind me of the arguments that were made some years back in favor of low-tar cigarettes. You may recall that full-tar cigarettes, full-tar unfiltered cigarettes, of course, cause heart disease and cancer and other problems. Then low-tar filtered cigarettes came out with the claim that they cause less heart disease and lung cancer. Well, you still get plenty of risk for those things. And so the same kind of analogy applies here. So sourdough bread is really not that different from unfermented bread. There are some small differences, but not enough to absolve you of all the problems associated with consuming sourdough bread. So among the claims, wild claims, such as sourdough bread is considered healthier than regular bread because of the fermentation process and the ingredients. Sourdough bread is more digestible, may have a lower glycemic index, and offers more beneficial nutrients. Other people claim that the healthiest bread is whole grain bread, particularly those made with sprouted whole grains or sourdough. These options offer more nutrients, fiber, and digestive benefits compared to white bread. Even the Mayo Clinic says on their website there are 3 proven benefits, they say, of sourdough bread. Supports a healthy gut microbiome. They claim that sourdough bread contains probiotic microbes. They say that it's more easily digested because sourdough fermentation decreases the gluten and FODMAPs carbohydrates, and this makes digestion easier and has benefits for those with digestive disorders like irritable bowel syndrome. We're going to talk about that also. And they claim, the Mayo Clinic also claims that sourdough bread supports better blood sugar control, because it has a lower glycemic index. Let's talk about why all these claims are patently false based on existing evidence. So, as a reminder, as a review, if you've read my wheat belly books, you know that there are many toxic components in this food that our U.S. government actually tells us to eat more of. So wheat contains gliadin and glutenin. And that combination, by the way, gliadin and glutenin, is what people call gluten. Gliadin is a globular protein. Glutenin is a chain-like polymer protein. And glutenin is the stuff that gives wheat dough, for instance, that kind of stretchability that allows someone to make a pizza dough and toss it in the air and twirl it and all those kinds of things. But the combination is called gluten. And gliadin, of course, is responsible for many adverse effects in humans, including partial digestion that leads to gliadin-derived opioid peptides that are appetite stimulants. It's also the initiating factor in many autoimmune diseases. The amylopectin A, that's the carbohydrate unique to wheat and grains that is highly digestible because it's very susceptible to the common enzyme amylase in your saliva and in your stomach, and that's why wheat products, even whole wheat, raises blood glucose higher than table sugar. Wheat products also contain the carbohydrates or fibers called amylose, ribosylin, fructans, raffinose, also labeled as FODMAPs. It contains cellulose, that's the thing that people typically regard as fiber, that's indigestible to humans but provides bulk. That's what people mostly think of when they say fiber. It contains wheat germagglutinin, that is a lectin protein that's completely impervious to human digestion. You ingest it, it comes out in the toilet completely intact, but in its transit from mouth to toilet, it is a highly toxic compound that in laboratory animals denudes or kills off or denudes all the villi, the hair-like projections for absorption in the intestinal tract, and does that in humans also. It contains phytates. These are compounds that bind minerals like calcium, magnesium, iron, and zinc, making them unavailable for absorption. That's why iron deficiency, for instance, is very common in people who consume wheat and grains. Potassium bromate is a whitening agent. Glyphosate, of course, is a component of herbicides, and those two things are highly toxic to humans. And there's other proteins like alpha amylase inhibitors, serpins, thyroreductases. They're mostly responsible for allergy, especially since agribusiness changed the structure of those proteins. But you can see, wheat, this is wheat in any form, is a collection of toxic compounds to humans. And we're going to talk about, is this true? Does sourdough fermentation reduce the toxicity of wheat? So when you ferment wheat into sourdough bread, you're taking advantage of the microbes that are resident in wheat, much as you ferment, say, cucumbers to make fermented pickles. You're taking advantage of the microbes resident on the surface. You could also add a starter culture, but in general, you're taking advantage of the microbes that are resident within the wheat plant. These are species you might find familiar, Lactobacillus plantarum, Lactobacillus brevis, other species like Lactococcus and Pediococcus. Sometimes fungal species participate in the fermentation process, sometimes they're added. There may be differences in the sourdough microbes in different regions. So for instance, if you're getting sourdough from San Francisco, you might be taking advantage of Lactobacillus sanfrancensis. And these fermentation microbes yield a number of byproducts that are responsible for the characteristic taste, texture, and smell of sourdough bread. Lactic acid, acetic acid, which is vinegar, carbon dioxide, ethanol, alcohol, and aldehyde, a metabolite of alcohol. What about this idea that because of the fermentation process, because of those resident microbes that are used to ferment the dough, are there microbes, are there probiotic species like the Mayo Clinic claims in sourdough bread? Is sourdough bread a source of probiotic microbes? No, of course not. Because to make sourdough bread, you bake at 450 to 500 degrees. That's the common temperature used. And that is the temperature sufficiently high that kills all microbes. You know, spore-forming microbes like Bacillus coagulans or Bacillus cereus are very resistant to heat, but even those spore-forming microbes all die. So there is nothing alive in sourdough bread. So this idea that sourdough bread is a source of probiotic species is completely and utterly false. There are no microbes in sourdough bread because the heat is sufficiently high to kill them. And wouldn't you know, if we looked at bowel flora composition before and after consumption of sourdough bread, there is no. So if there were probiotic species in sourdough bread, as there are in other fermented species that are not baked or heated, you would see shifts in microbial composition in the gastrointestinal microbiome. You'd likely see such things as an increase in lactobacillus species, an increase in other beneficial species because of collaborative effects among microbes. You would see a decrease in unhealthy species like proteobacteria species like E. coli and Salmonella. But when the bowel flora has been examined in people before and after sourdough consumption, there is no difference because there are no probiotic species in sourdough bread, despite what the Mayo Clinic and other people claim. That's true for bacteria, it's true for fungal species. How about the amylopectin A carbohydrate? Well, the carbohydrate content of sourdough bread is really no different, and in some cases higher than unfermented bread. And likewise, if we look at the glycemic index of sourdough bread, it's no better. It's the same as whole wheat bread, as you can see in the left-sided graph. And if we look at insulin levels, they're actually somewhat higher when you consume sourdough bread. And that's when you provoke insulin, it leads over time to insulin resistance, the unresponsiveness of muscle, brain, other organs to insulin resistance, and that leads over time to various effects like expansion of abdominal fat, weight gain, higher triglycerides, fatty liver, increased risk for coronary disease, heart disease, breast cancer, type 2 diabetes, dementia. So sourdough bread is actually a little bit worse than wheat bread that's unfermented when gauged by glycemic index and insulin responses. How about that gliadin and gluten? That is the two components of gluten. Well, here's a study that looked at alpha gliadin, gamma gliadin, and omega gliadin, the various fractions of gliadin in sourdough bread compared to unfermented bread. They're actually a little bit higher, not lower. So fermentation does not reduce gluten content. It actually increases modestly gliadin content. Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification because there are manipulations you can do that do reduce it, but it takes prolonged fermentation with numerous microbes in collaboration. But that's rarely done in everyday practice in bakeries or in your home. So in general, sourdough bread increases the gliadin content, thereby the gluten content of sourdough bread. So this idea that sourdough fermentation reduces gluten is patently false. Now, fermentation does fragment the gluten or the gliadin protein. What does that do? Well, when you fragment the gliadin protein and you increase its content a bit, you make it more accessible to an enzyme lining your intestinal tract called transglutaminase 2. That's the enzyme that allows the provocation of celiac disease. So sourdough fermentation fragments the gliadin protein that makes it more accessible to the transglutaminase 2 enzyme, thereby making it more likely to stimulate a celiac type immune response. Contrary to what people say, contrary to what the Mayo Clinic says, fermentation does not reduce the gliadin protein. How about this very toxic compound called wheat germ agglutinin? What does sourdough fermentation do? Essentially nothing. In other words, this idea that fermentation reduces the toxic compounds like wheat germ agglutinin, this is not true. There's essentially no change in the wheat germ agglutinin content after sourdough fermentation. Now, the only exception to the nonsense you're being told about sourdough bread is that there is indeed a reduction in phytates. Recall that phytates are the compounds in wheat that bind nutrients, positively charged minerals, calcium, magnesium, zinc, and iron, and some others, and it makes it unavailable for absorption. Well, sourdough fermentation, because of the acidity achieved via the lactic acid and other acids produced, does make sourdough bread more acidic, and that does indeed reduce phytate content about 80%. So that's the one fact that is indeed true in all these claims that sourdough bread is beneficial or less harmful. That's the only thing true. None of the other claims are true. How about this claim that sourdough bread is better tolerated by people with irritable bowel syndrome? Here's a study that looked at symptoms in people with irritable bowel syndrome given sourdough bread. They actually had more symptoms, worse symptoms. So in this study, they said that there were significantly more feelings of tiredness, joint symptoms, and decreased alertness when the participants ate the sourdough bread. Now, wait a minute. The Mayo Clinic says sourdough bread is better tolerated in people with IBS. Simply not true. They didn't do whoever wrote that piece for the Mayo Clinic simply did not examine the evidence, did not do their homework, came out with just an echo of the broad claims that sourdough fermentation somehow disables all the adverse components of bread, which is simply not true. So, in summary, the baking temperature used to make sourdough bread kills all microbes. There are no probiotics in sourdough bread. There's essentially no change in amylopectin content. There's no change in glycemic index, nor in blood glucose, but there seems to be an increase in insulin responses, which is not a good thing. There's a fragmentation of the gliadin protein, which makes it more susceptible to transformation by the transglutaminase 2 enzyme, making it more likely to trigger a celiac immune response. There is essentially no change in wheat germ agglutinin. There is the one true thing among all these claims is that there is indeed a reduction in phytates due to the acidification achieved via fermentation, and the symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome are simply not reduced. And in fact, if we judge by the evidence, there's an increase in symptoms from IBS. And so these claims you see, even from otherwise trusted sources like Mayo Clinic, are patently untrue. Sourdough bread is not healthier. It's no different, in all practicality, really no different than any other form of bread, and in some aspects may actually be worse. I often say that half my role in health is not just propagating healthy information that I believe to be true, but also batting down misinformation. And in our modern world, misinformation is becoming more and more prevalent. It becomes more and more important for you not to be susceptible to misinformation in the form of bad advice, even from what you thought was a trusted healthcare source, healthcare information source, or from clickbait or other sources of misinformation. Know that you have access to information that can disprove a lot of these widely held claims, false claims. Now, this discussion on the many false ideas being propagated about sourdough bread is an abbreviated version of a longer talk I provided to my inner circle, my drdavisinfinitehealth.com inner circle. If you're interested in a more extended conversation of this topic as well as other topics and the prolonged discussion, the lengthy discussion we had afterwards about these topics, then I invite you to join my innercircle.drdavisinfinitehealth.com website.